My name is Joanna Podolska, and I represent the Marek Edelman Dialogue Center in Łódź. And I am honored to welcome today Annette Libeskind Berkovits, who was born in Kyrgyzstan but grew up in Łódź, in the city where I am living and I am based with a dialogue center. And we will talk about a book which was published in 2014 in English as In the Unlikeliest of Places. And we published it in Poland and in Polish language under the title Życie, pełne, barw, The Life with Many Colors. And so I want to thank you very much, Annette, that you agreed to present your book and to give us, we are not the official, we are not the editor house, but we loved the book about your father, and we wanted very much to have it in Polish. And it is my first question. How did you react for how the public, first English public, reacts for your book? It was published in 2014. What they told you? What was the reaction?
Thank you very much, Joanna, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you again, and it's a real pleasure and an honor for me for the Center for Dialogue in Łódź, Poland, to translate my book and publish it, and to really do an outstanding translation. Translation in and of itself is an art, and it's not easy.
Dorota Dekiert, who translated it from
Yes, she is absolutely fabulous, and the design of the book is beautiful. Here, this is the English edition. They both have my father's military picture on the cover, and if one were to get close to the cover, they would see his signature on the lower right in Yiddish, because he was proud to be a Polish Jewish soldier. Now, you asked me about the reception regarding my book. To answer your question and to elaborate on the reception of the book when it first came out in 2014, it was one of the very few books that had come out about the survival of Polish Jews in the Soviet Union. The fact of the matter is that for a very long time, until relatively recently, those who survived in the Soviet Union were not even considered survivors, which is absurd because they survived horrible conditions in prison camps. Of course, they did survive, but not everyone did. Thousands and thousands died in the Soviet prison camps called gulags. So first, there was a surprise that the story was new. But also, I had a lot of wonderful responses about my father and his persona. I had one person write a review saying, "I don't know how it's possible, but I fell in love with a dead man. He is no longer here, but he inspires me because of his openness and his total lack of bitterness about what happened to his family and to him. He was able to sort of overcome the sorrow, and it's probably because he was always a person with a very sunny personality. Actually, at his funeral, his youngest granddaughter, Rachel, said, "My Zaida always walked on the sunny side of the street." And he did. He loved people. He loved humanity. He could always find something good about everybody. You take the most annoying person, he found something good about them.
I am in the team of these people who love your father. After I know him from your book, I think he was a beautiful person, and I wish to know him. Actually, what your one of the granddaughters told about him, also his son Daniel Libeskind wrote about him in our introduction, and in English introduction probably as well, that your father saw everywhere rainbow, that the word for him was colorful. So it is why we propose this new title for the Polish edition, because his life, even that it was in a terrible moment, in the very difficult times, he wanted to see the good part of life. He wanted to see good people, or even if people were not good, he wanted to see something good in them.
Yes, it's true. I'll give you an interesting example. When he was arrested and being sent by the Soviet authorities to the Gulag, he went by ship way north of Moscow to the frozen tundra. But while he was on the Volga River, instead of saying, "Oh my God, I've been arrested, I'm a prisoner," he was thinking, "My God, I'm seeing the Volga River. It's so amazing. I've read about it as a child in school and I'm now on it." But I want to add something, that despite his sunny personality, he was not someone who buried the past. He wanted to talk about the past. He didn't only talk about the good things. Since I was a little girl, he told me about the Jewish history. Very few survivors talked about it. My mother, for example, wasn't one to discuss it. She survived in Siberia, but she wasn't inclined to talk about it. My father's sister, who was an Auschwitz survivor, never talked about it.
Could you tell something about your background, about your family? You told us that that it is what you learned really from childhood, that you knew about your family. It was a family from the shtetl, not from the city of Łódź, but from the shtetl Przedbusz, which is about 40 kilometers from Łódź. But he grew up in Łódź. Could you tell something about your family?
I'll be happy to. My father's family came from the town of Przedbusz, as you said, but he was born in Łódź. My grandfather, whom I unfortunately never met, Chaim Chaskel Libeskind, was a carpenter. But people from the villages saw a better life in the big city, and Łódź was such a big industrial city that many people from the smaller towns moved to the big city. And once they moved to the big city, they worked in the trades. My grandfather did not. He put away his carpentry tools under the bed, and my father only saw them when he was a little boy. My parents had a tiny, tiny little grocery store that was really the back of their apartment. They had a very nice, peaceful family, 3 sons and 2 daughters. My father was the youngest of the family. He was the baby of the family. He was born when my grandmother was about to go into menopause. So he was a big, big surprise. So between his mother and his 2 sisters, it was like having 3 mothers and 2 big brothers. And he had a very happy childhood growing up in Łódź. He always remembers Łódź in the fondest of terms. And he was in the first class of a school by the Vladimir Medem School.
Which is actually very amazing, because it was the first generation, the first boy in the family who was educated not in the cheder, not in the Jewish religious school, but in a public,
that's right.
Very avant-garde school for those times.
It was avant-garde. It was probably even avant-garde for this time. And his 2 older brothers persuaded their father not to send him to the cheder and to give him a secular education. And the primary language in the school was Yiddish. So my father became a big lover of the Yiddish language, and they encouraged the arts. And I think that's where my father's artistic inclinations flowered.
Mm.
Well, he didn't become an artist until 70 years later, but he had that inspiration from early on. And it was a secular school where it was basically a lot of people sent their children there because the school was free, and for the most part they were poor. They couldn't afford other kinds of secular education. So he forged very, very close ties with his friends in the Medham School, friendships that lasted his entire life. For his 90th birthday in Israel, I managed to bring two of his friends, also 90, who came from New York, and one lived in Israel. So he had three of his classmates from elementary school at his 90th birthday, and they remained friends. When he came to America in 1958, he had no place to live. And his friends took him in. He was hosted by all his old Medham School friends, and they all fought for him to stay with them. So he stayed a week here and a week there and a week there.
I have a feeling that Nachman was Buddhist all his life. The value he grew up with, the Buddhist values were very important for him till the end.
Yes, he believed strongly in the ideals of the Jewish Labor Bund. Let's make sure it's the Jewish Labor Bund and not confuse it with the German Bund. Yeah. But what appealed to him was the human rights issues and women's rights issues. And my father was probably one of the earliest feminists, or the earliest feminists that I knew. He was very much for women's rights, and he believed those Jewish Labor Bund values all his life. However, in post-war Poland, he did not engage with the Bund because he felt it was very influenced by communists. And for the listening audience who doesn't know it, the Bundists and the communists hated each other. They were not at all similar. So I don't want to get into a big political discussion now, but Bundists were not communists.
Yeah. Actually, you know, I am from the Marek Edelman Dialogue Center, and he was Buddhist. And all his life he underlined in interviews exactly that he hated communism, of course. And actually, it is very amazing that the Dialogue Center, named after Marek Edelman, published a book about Nachman Libeskind, who was Buddhist also from his background. I want to ask you you tell us about it. So was it a long idea that you wanted to write a book, or actually it happened because you discovered the tapes your father recorded for you? Of course, you gave him these tapes, but how was with the book?
Okay, so you are asking me about how the book came into existence. Well, I had always wanted to write because I was inspired by my mother, who always wanted to be a writer. So my husband persuaded me to retire so I could write. That is my mother, Dora Libeskind, Dora Blaustein from before her marriage. In any case, shortly after I retired, I decided to clean up my father's closet. He was living with us the last couple of years of his life. And I discovered a set of tapes that he had narrated both in English and in Yiddish about his life. Now, many of the stories I knew because he had been telling me his life story all his life. So it was not unfamiliar material, but there was a lot of detail in it. And I felt those tapes were my instructions to move forward and finally write a book, get started with writing. I did a lot of research about that period, about the history. And it was very inspiring for me to have him played on my computer, listening to him as I wrote. And so he was with me the whole time I wrote the book.
What do you plan to do with the tapes? Do you want to give it to some museum? Would you like to keep it to your family? Did you think about it? Because it's, you know, to listen to his voice, it's so amazing.
I haven't decided. I wanted to my children to and my grandkids to weigh on it, whether they want to keep them or whether we can make good enough recordings that we could give up the actual tapes. So yes, I've thought about it, but I don't know the answer.
Okay. We talk about his background before the war, and in 1939 the war broke out. And could you tell about the beginning of the war and how he became a prisoner in Gulag?
The Polish president Mościcki called all able-bodied persons to come and defend Warsaw, the capital. So my father and his brothers and his friends and thousands of Polish people came out and started walking or getting however they could toward Warsaw. But the Nazis started strafing and shooting people down in the fields. It was brutal. The planes came down very low and just started shooting people. So my father right away got the idea that the Germans would be different this time around. He had experienced the Germans in World War I when he was a little boy. And he actually had a couple of encounters with German soldiers at the World War I period, where they were very nice to him. One soldier grabbed him, tried to put him in a cockpit of a plane, even though my father was frightened and kicked and ran away. And one soldier tried to give him chocolate. So people didn't think of the German military as being brutal to civilians. But the minute my father saw what was happening on the march toward Warsaw, he like something just went off in his head. This is not going to be the same. And of course, when they finally got to Warsaw, the Germans had already closed access, and they told everybody to return home. They wanted to frighten the population into cooperating. So they told everybody, go back home, start your life, everything is normal. Well, of course, it was anything but normal. And as he came closer back towards Łódź, the German soldiers made them clean up the dead bodies and the dead horses. And that made such a horrible impression in his mind. He just knew he had to get away. And he had some anti-Semitic experiences prior to the war, and he put it all together and he said, no, we're not going to stay here, we've got to get away. And he tried to persuade every member of his family, let's escape across the border to Russia. But at that point, the Germans, the river Bug was the border, was the eastern border, and the Nazis occupied one side of the river, and of course the Soviet military was in the other. So anybody contemplating crossing of the river Bug was literally taking their life in their hands. But my father thought it was still better than remaining in Poland. Everybody in his family thought he was crazy. They thought it was unreasonable. They said, how can you leave your home? You leave your furniture, you leave everything behind. How can you do that? But you know, he begged everyone to go, his brothers, his sisters, nobody wanted to go. And he crossed the Bug River and with great risk at night alone. A peasant took him across the river in a little boat. There was shooting on both sides. He made it through. And there he wandered around the Russian area trying to make his way to Vilna, Vilno in Polish, where the rumors were that if you were a member of the Jewish Labor Bund and if you made it there, you might get an exit visa to a foreign country, to Brazil or China or somewhere else. Well, by the time he made it to cross the border into what is now Lithuania, the border was closed and he couldn't go. And I should note that when the Polish people crossed the border and came into Russia, they were arrested by the Soviet authorities and they sent them to gulags. And that's where my father lived for, I think about 18 months. I can't remember offhand how long it was. He saw hundreds of his fellow inmates die of starvation and disease. And then the Polish government in exile made a pact with the Russians to release the Polish prisoners. And that's how my father made his way on foot and by everything that could move, cart and train, and all the way south to Samarkand. And it was there that he met my mother. A lot of the survivors tried to get as far south as they could because they had experienced such cold conditions where they were imprisoned. They were frozen, they had frostbite. They just wanted to get someplace warm. That's all they cared about, someplace warm. So, you know, it's close to the foothills of the Himalayas. They couldn't cross the Himalayas. So they remained, they were in Samarkand first, and then they went to Kyrgyzstan, where my parents met and where I was born. Mm-hmm. That's that part of the story.
Yeah. Actually, sometimes some people say that the parents usually tell completely different stories about how they met. Did you have a different stories from mother and from your father, or did they agree about the first meetings and the first moments?
That's a good question. My mother didn't talk a lot about it.
Yes,
my mother just didn't want to talk about that period. She was extremely depressed much of the time. She didn't want to talk about it.
But even about your father and about the beginning of their life?
She was living with a friend who helped her survive Siberia. And my father was living with two of his gulag friends. And one of them came in one day and he said, I heard there was a bunch of Jewish girls living someplace. He said the address. Let's go meet them. Mm-hmm. So they came in, and the three guys and my mother and her friends, and they met and they found a lot in common, but a lot different, because these guys were from, I think most of them were from Łódź, but my mother and her friends were from Warsaw. So they were like from two opposing camps.
Oh, no, come on, not so opposing, but yes, some competing and
competing.
Especially,
yes.
But actually something what they had in common, the language and the culture, literature and the music, yes, Yiddish.
They did have a lot in common, and they sang a lot of, they were musical, all of them. So they sang a lot of Yiddish songs. They spent the evening singing Yiddish songs. And since there was no food, there was such starvation that my mother and her two friends made, like, they had some dry bread and they made dry toast. So they had dry toast, and to my father, it tasted like the best cake in the world. So that was the refreshments that they had.
So it was your house, your home language, Yiddish?
I had three home languages. My father spoke Yiddish to me primarily. My mother spoke to me Polish almost exclusively. Yes, yes. My mother was a lover of the Polish language, and she went to school. She went to a school, and her education was in Polish. And I think the mix of the different languages made my brain sort of more plastic. So it's easy for me to learn foreign languages. I learned them pretty well. You know, when I came to America at age 16, I didn't know a word of English. And the first week of my time in New York, I went to school not knowing a single word. And all I remember is standing in the hallway when the bell rang and all the students went into their classrooms. I was standing in the hallway crying because I didn't know where my room was and I didn't know how to ask. So, but a few months later, I was speaking English. So the mixture of languages when I was young was very helpful.
So actually, you was born in Kyrgyzstan, but your brother Daniel Libeskind, who is very famous architect, he was born in Łódź, and just I discovered today that in 2 months, or even yes, in 2 months, it will be 75 years since you came to Łódź, came back to Łódź for your father, for Nachman, for you first time. And for your brother, we joke that Daniel Libeskind was waiting for Łódź to be born.
He was. My mother was, about 8 months pregnant when they boarded, we boarded cattle. We were sleeping on the floor of the cattle train. And I remember that every time the train would stop, my father would hop off the train and go to the locomotive where the steam was dripping off, and he would catch the warm water in a pot to give to my mother to wash me. I remember that. And I remember our arrival in Łódź was quite dramatic because my parents had nothing. The only thing they had was a sack of salt. In any case, when my father carried the sack of salt with him as if it was his treasure, because he thought somehow that he could sell it because he had no other source of money. But when we arrived in our first stop in Oświęcim, which is Auschwitz, we had to switch trains, a different gauge of track. We had to switch to a passenger train. And the passenger trains were so packed with soldiers and people coming and going that the conductors would not allow my father to board the train with a sack of salt. It was too big and too bulky. So my father saw that my mother was ready to give birth at any minute. And he had heard through the grapevine that his sister had survived and that she was living in Łódź. Yes, that's the sister. So he gave my mother a piece of paper with her address and had her board the passenger train with me. My mother had never been to Łódź in her life, and she arrived in the evening just as curfew began. Her sister-in-law, who she never met, was supposed to be living, and we climbed the many stairs to get to the apartment, and a lady cracked the door open and said, "No, she's not living here anymore. This morning she went for the displaced person camps in Germany." And she slammed the door shut, and there we were, my mother standing there ready to give birth with a crying child, didn't know where to go. She was crying. We went out into the street, and we passed what must have been a government building, a big, large building. I still would love to find out what it was. And there was a guardhouse with a female soldier, a huge woman, which at least she seemed that way to me. She had a Russian green coat all the way down to her ankles and epaulets. And she said to my mother in Russian, "What are you doing out here? It's curfew. You have to get off the street." And she noticed my mother was pregnant. So she invited us to go in her tiny little guardhouse. And I remember it. I remember there was a pot-bellied stove and a little cot. And she said, put put your child here to sleep. And I remember, all I remember is that my mother covered me with like a military blanket that was very harsh on my face, and I fell asleep. And towards the morning, my mother went into labor. And it must have been this woman, soldier, who got my mother to the displaced persons building where there was, I guess, a hospital. I don't know if it was a hospital. I don't really know what the facility was, but my mother gave birth to my brother on our first morning in Łódź.
So we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of Daniel Libeskind just in a few weeks in Łódź. How do you remember these 10 years you spent in Łódź? And anyway, you could not write the book without your memory, because in that moment, the father was not with you. And how much, maybe before I ask about these 10 years, I want to ask how much in a book you have from these tapes of your father, and how much is your memory and your research. Could you tell something about it? How much did you have to make research, to find, to discover the things to write it?
I would say, I've never thought about sort of giving specific percentages, but around, I would say that at least 80% is from my father's tapes, and the remaining 20% would be spent between my memories and my research. My research were mostly on facts, you know, facts about the gulags and facts about the military actions and the negotiations between the Polish government and exile and so forth. My feelings and recollections only had to do with the fact that my father and I traveled to Poland together 3 times. And one time I traveled there after my father passed away with my husband. So I juxtaposed my own feelings and observations against my father's. So I guess that's the answer to your question.
Once again, I want to tell you that you can read Annette Libeskind Berkovits' book in Polish, Życie, pełne, barw, or unfortunately you have to show the English one.
Okay.
And tell the English title.
In the unlikeliest of places.
Yes.
Now, I want to say something about the 2 titles because it's interesting.
Yes.
Życie, pełne, barw, Life Full of Colors, is a wonderful title. I wish I had thought about it when I was doing the English version, because it's a great title. It does.
Thank you.
It does say a great deal about my father's personality and his artwork. He found himself in all kinds of unlikely places. But the original title that I proposed, which the English editor didn't like, was, I'll say it in Polish, urodzony w czapku.
Ah, okay.
Because
you have English version of this title, because in Polish it sounds yes, it's proverb.
Yes, because you know that's lucky. It was my English title for it was Born in a Lucky Call, C-A-U-L, and they felt a lot of English readers won't get the idea. The call is a membrane that a baby is born with. Like a little cap. Some babies are born like that, and that says the person will be lucky. And my father was very lucky. Some of the luck was just fate, and some of the luck he made himself by his decisions. So anyway, it could have any number of titles. I like all 3 of them.
Yeah, great. We have only 15 minutes left. So first I want to ask about your own experience, and also, but you also talk about it in a book about your 10 years in Łódź, because you grew up in Łódź, you was in school, and how do you remember this time?
We had a very close family. We grew up in Łódź, being cared for by a wonderful, I guess she was like sort of housekeeper and nanny, a woman named Marisha. And she was like a member of our family. We had a tiny apartment, which maybe for those times wasn't so unusual, but we had one bedroom and a living room and a kitchen, and that was it. And all 5 of us lived in that space. So it was pretty tight. We were very close. My mother ran her own business, which in and of itself was quite amazing, because the post-war Poland had a communist government and private businesses were not welcome. I don't know if you can see that. That's on the left here is my mother in front of her shop. My mother was a maker of corsets and braziers, in Polish, gorseciarka, and at that time in post-war Poland, there was no really department stores where a woman could go and buy a brassiere. You had to go and have somebody make it for you. And my mother had this skill since she was a young girl. She learned how to sew from her mother, my grandmother, whom I never met. She was exterminated by the Nazis. But my mother did something very unusual for the time, for any family, maybe especially for an Orthodox Jewish family that she came from. She left home at the age of 18 and opened her own corsetry shop with her girlfriend on, those of you who know Warsaw, on Marszałkowska Street, which was quite a thing for a young girl to do. And she spent a lot of her time at the shop. So we didn't spend that much time with her. We spent more time with my father, who worked at a textile business in Poland, at Centrala Tekstylna, and with our nanny housekeeper, Marisha. So we had a very close-knit life. We enjoyed vacations in Krynica, Zakopane. I enjoyed mountain climbing with my father. He loved mountain climbing in Zakopane. So we had a good life. I went to school, Pierwsza TPD, and it was an all-girls school. We wore uniforms. And till this day, I have friends from that school. I have a friend, Danuta Grzesikowska, who was at the time Danuta Czarnota, and we have remained friends till this day. And I have a friend in Australia from that same class, Anya Ackerman. And there was another girl, Swavka Lustig, who is in Israel. I've lost touch with her now, but I was in touch with her when I lived in Israel. So childhood friendships persist for a long time. I have a memory of something that happened at a certain point. I must have been in the 3rd grade or 4th grade, I can't remember, where prayer came into school. And they announced that the class would start with a prayer. And I felt very uncomfortable about it. And I sort of, I don't know how I mustered up the courage, but I gathered my 3 or 4 Jewish girls that were in that class, and we walked out of class, shocking the teacher, and we walked down to the principal's office, and he was stunned to see these three little girls, four of them, And I explained that I thought it was unfair of us to have to either say a Catholic prayer or to sit there and listen to it. And he was wonderful. He said, you don't have to. You could stay out for the prayer time. So we ran around the hallways and slid on the banisters and had a great old time. Mm. So
most of your memories from Poland, from which are rather good. Do you because you know your father Nachman, we can tell that actually his feelings to his native city were amazing. He loved Łódź all his life, and he talked about the city very good. Did you share his love to Łódź, or do you have?
I have to say that my take on it was different, because compared to, you know, as a young child growing up, all my friends had aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas, and we had nobody. I had absolutely no one. So it was a very lonely life. We had a good life, love from our parents and from Marisha, but we had no one else. You know, when children would say, "I'm going to see Babcia or Jadek," we didn't have anybody like this. And I became very acutely aware that something big was missing in my life. Mm. So that colored my perceptions. That colored my perceptions greatly. And the contrast from when we left in 1957, went to Israel, and my mother had sisters and brothers who had either been survivors or who had gone to Palestine before it became Israel. There was family there. I had lots of cousins and aunts and uncles. I say that I shared the same kind of feelings as my father had. My father remembered Łódź. He liked Łódź, he loved Łódź at all times, but his pre-war Łódź was so vibrant. He told me about how many Jewish newspapers there were, and theaters and cinemas and art events, and it was thriving and bubbling and exciting, and that's not what we saw post-war.
We have to finish very soon, but I want we finish with beautiful paintings we see behind you. So they are paintings of your father and yes. Nachman Libeskind, and you will if you want to know more about it, what we are not able to talk today, so please read the book in Polish or in English. You can discover it. Annette Libeskind Berkovits is an author, but we unfortunately we don't have enough time to talk more. But Nachman became an artist. Could you tell something about it? So yes. You moved to United States. He educated children, very well educated, both of you. You became specialists in two wonderful fields. You are very successful. And when he retired, he became the artist.
Yes, it sort of didn't happen by accident. It was a plan of my mother's. My mother, well, we all saw his artistic talents. He would draw us beautiful birthday cards. So everybody knew he was talented, but he worked all his life and he was an immigrant. So, you know, in the United States, he had a very difficult job working in a print shop, and he traveled to our home in the Bronx by subway. He had no time. And then my mother became ill with cancer, and he took care of her. So there was no time for him to engage in painting. But my mother had a plan. She called him to her bedside shortly before she passed away. And I was in the room, and it just broke my heart, because she made him sit by her bedside. She said, "Sit right here with me." And she took his hand and she said, "You have to make me a promise." And he said, "Promise? What promise? What? And she said, "You have to promise me that when I die, you will begin to, you will finally begin to paint. And he said, die? What are you talking about? Who's dying? You're not dying. He refused to believe that she was going to die. He was such an optimist. And she said, no, I don't want to hear this. I want you to say, I promise. And he did. And so shortly after she died, I took him to his place in Florida, where I am right now. And I said, okay, let's go shopping. He said, shopping for what? I said, we have to buy art supplies. He said, what art supplies? For what? I said, we promised. So I took him to a huge art supply warehouse, and I had no idea what he needed. I bought everything in sight, all kinds of paints, gouaches, oil paints, I don't know, colors of all sorts, brushes, canvases. I threw everything into a big shopping cart. And I said, before I left, because I was with him for 2 weeks, and I said, this is your job. This is what you have to do now. And it was, I don't know, maybe a month or two, I can't remember later, he called me at home in New York, and he said, I did it. I said, what did you do? He said, do you remember the promise? I said, you painted a painting? He said, no. I was like, stunned. What do you mean, no? He said, who said it had to be a painting? It's a collage. So he did a collage. He used the felt that my mother used for her craft projects. She did beautiful fiber crafts. He used her felt, and he made a beautiful piece, which I don't have here to show you. It's called Lonely Bird. And that was his start. But he had, I think well over 20 exhibitions. His work was exhibited in galleries. I was going to say for listeners who are interested in seeing some of his work, please go on my website, AnnetteBerkovits.com. Very easy. ANNETTE together, no space, .com. You will go on the gallery. You will see more about my father, and you will see his paintings, and you will see pictures of his family that I didn't have a chance to talk about, and my other books and so on. But the paintings behind me, there is one, I don't know if you could see, there's a painting of flowers. One year, he knew we were going to come to Florida, my husband's and my anniversary. And he said, I got you flowers. And I said, well, they'll dry up by the time we get there. He said, don't worry, these flowers will be with you for a long time. Mm-hmm. And he painted these flowers for our anniversary in this beautiful Chinese kind of pot. So
in the book, you are trying to, you explain that your father didn't want to explain the painting. It's very difficult to explain the paintings, but did you think about it, what your father wanted to tell you or tell to people?
Yes, I thought that
very
was
important.
So this painting is called Sonata, and I think you could see it online too. I found this was to be the most enigmatic and complex painting. One of the things we didn't get to talk about, it was my father's love of music. And if you read the book, you'll find my interpretation of the meaning of that painting, which may be right, I don't know. This is from knowing him and from knowing how he loved music, I made my own interpretation of the painting like an art critic. So
I hope you will be able to come this year to Poland. We dreamt about it. Yes, we plan your visit in your city, in the city of your father. You know that you are very welcome, and we will be following the Nachman tracks. So I hope the people who watch us can read the book. I really recommend it. But for the end, please tell few words, because you are working and it is just published in November. last year your poetry,
Yes.
a book of poetry, and it is almost, you are almost in the end of a book based on your mother's story. Could you tell something to recommend for a future talk about?
Oh, yes. Well, I finished a novel called To Swallow the World. In Polish, it would be Połknąć świat, which is based on my mother's history, very fascinating history. It's a novel. It's not a book about my mother, but it's a book inspired by my mother. She always inspires me. She was an incredible thinker. She was a real philosopher, my mother. I'm working on a new novel, I'm trying to challenge myself to write a novel in magical realism. And I finished a poetry book that deals with my emotions about a medical disaster that happened to our son. And I have another manuscript which I need to work on getting published, which is called Learning to Speak American, not learning to speak English, learning to speak American, which is my coming of age story. That one has a lot more about me growing up in Poland and it goes from my birth in Kyrgyzstan to Poland, to Israel, and my first few years in America. It stops there. And I had written a book about my career at the Bronx Zoo in New York that took me all over the world to work on behalf of saving wild places and wild animals.
Thank you, Annette, that you are with us. Thank you so much for your beautiful book about your father. And we are looking forward for coming books, and take care.
Thank you so much, Johanna. You have done such an incredible job getting the funds to get it translated and produced, and to produce that beautiful cover. I really love it. And you have included a lot of photos from my family, which are not in the English edition. There, if you want to see photos from the family, you have to get the Polish edition.
Thank you so much, and to see you in Łódź soon.
Always a pleasure to see you and to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.